The office had grown still when Marcus finally lifted his gaze from the glowing monitor. That's when he noticed Thomas Crawford standing beside his workspace, jacket buttoned, car keys dangling loosely from his fingers, wearing that polite but exhausted smile that signaled the day had officially ended. Before Marcus could even form a question, Thomas spoke in an easy, almost offhand tone, explaining that his wife's vehicle had given out that afternoon and wondering if Marcus might be willing to give her a lift since they lived in the same direction. The request caught Marcus slightly unprepared, not because it was complicated, but because it felt strangely intimate in a way professional favors rarely did. Still, he nodded without hesitation, not wanting to appear reluctant or uncooperative, and gathered his belongings as they made their way toward the elevator. Thomas mentioned how chaotic the evening had become, and expressed genuine appreciation. Marcus listened, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest he couldn't quite explain. When the elevator doors parted to reveal the underground parking structure, Claire Crawford was already there beside a sleek gray sedan, arms crossed loosely against the evening chill, her posture composed, yet somehow distant. Marcus noticed immediately how different she appeared compared to the formal glimpses he'd caught of her before. Less polished now, more authentic, and she offered a warm smile when Thomas made proper introductions, thanking Marcus for stepping in, her voice soft but confident. After exchanging a few courteous words, Thomas excused himself without a trace of doubt, leaving Marcus holding the keys and a responsibility that suddenly felt weightier than a simple commute. As they settled into the vehicle, silence descended quickly, not uncomfortable but substantial, as though something unspoken had already entered the space between them. Marcus concentrated on turning the ignition and navigating out of the garage while Claire adjusted her position and turned her attention to the window, city lights casting gentle reflections across her features. He reminded himself to approach this like any ordinary gesture, just transportation, nothing deeper. But the stillness felt electric. As they merged onto the busy streets, the evening traffic surrounded them, horns echoing in the distance, pedestrians weaving across crosswalks, life rushing past outside. While inside the car, time seemed to stretch. Claire broke the quiet by thanking him once more, mentioning how the day had dragged on far longer than anticipated. Marcus responded casually, noting that extended hours had become routine lately. Without any deliberate intention, their conversation shifted quickly, bypassing pleasantries and landing on mutual frustrations about demanding schedules, missed suppers, and how careers sometimes consumed every available space without ever asking consent. Marcus found himself surprised at how effortlessly words flow. Wed. How natural it felt to speak openly, without performing or protecting any facade. Claire listened attentively, nodding, contributing her own observations, confessing that she often felt her days were orchestrated for her before she even opened her eyes. That statement stayed with him because he recognized it intimately. As traffic crawled near a stoplight, Marcus glanced sideways and found her watching him, not with curiosity or criticism, just presence. The moment dissolved quickly, but left behind a quiet electricity, not unsettling, just genuine. The signal changed, and the city resumed its motion while Marcus drove, hyper-aware of every sound, the gentle purr of the motor, the faraway wail of emergency vehicles, the steady pulse of the pavement. He recognized he hadn't felt this alert in ages, not anxious precisely, but fully conscious. Claire spoke again, inquiring how long he'd been working under Thomas. Marcus answered directly, describing his position, his aspirations for advancement someday. She smiled at that, remarking that drive was admirable, but wondering aloud whether it sometimes came at the expense of joy. Marcus didn't respond immediately because the question felt bigger than the moment, bigger than the journey. Instead, he concentrated on the road, sensing the heaviness of it settle deep within him, and the vehicle continued through recognizable streets. Yet everything felt subtly altered, as if something mundane had transformed without warning. Marcus understood even then, before the trip concluded, that accepting this request had placed him on a trajectory he hadn't foreseen. As they turned onto the main avenue leading away from the city center, the night expanding before them, the silence returned, not hollow this time, but brimming with questions neither was prepared to voice. The drive continued smoothly and steadily, carrying more than just 2 passengers toward a destination neither fully grasped. Yet, the cityscape opened up as Marcus drove beyond the downtown core, traffic growing sparse, while street lamps stretched into long ribbons of amber across the windshield. Without conscious thought, he lowered the radio volume, creating room for conversation that now came easier than it had moments before. Claire reclined slightly in her seat, exhaling as though she'd been holding tension all day, observing that the stillness felt welcome after such commotion. Marcus agreed, mentioning he often chose the scenic route home simply to decompress. That simple admission seemed to invite deeper honesty between them, because Claire grinned and confessed she occasionally lingered in the car after reaching her driveway, postponing the moment of going inside, and Marcus understood completely. As they passed shuttered storefronts and darkened cafes, the outside world felt remote, granting them space to converse without distraction. Claire inquired about Marcus's existence beyond the workplace, not in a perfunctory manner, but with interest. He shared stories about his upbringing in a modest town, relocating to the metropolis, carrying more optimism than strategy, and discovering rapidly that maturity arrived quicker than anyone prepared you for. She listened intently, posing follow-up questions, responding with subdued laughter at appropriate moments. When she revealed her own history, it caught him off guard, because she spoke of aspirations she once harbored that had gradually been set aside, about how existence had grown comfortable yet constricting, secure yet monotonous. Marcus experienced a powerful surge of empathy because her words echoed thoughts he seldom articulated. The vehicle pressed forward, smooth and constant, while something within him transformed. As they paused briefly at a crimson light, rain began descending, gentle initially, then intensifying, the sound occupying the silence in a manner that felt personal rather than oppressive. Claire observed the droplets tracing paths down the glass, remarking that she treasured evenings like this because they made the city feel truthful. Marcus replied instinctively that authenticity was uncommon but essential. She pivoted toward him, startled, saying she hadn't anticipated that response. He shrugged, smiling faintly, admitting he hadn't planned to offer it either. The light shifted, drawing them back into movement, but the bond persisted, and they discussed music next, songs that evoked happier periods, lyrics that remained with you longer than faces. Claire acknowledged there were melodies she deliberately avoided because they summoned recollections she wasn't prepared to revisit. Marcus said he possessed a few of those himself, compositions linked to seasons when life overflowed with promise. The rain intensified, drumming faster against the roof, establishing a cadence that matched the tempo of their exchange. The road curved through a tranquiler neighborhood, residences dim and motionless. Claire's voice grew gentler as she admitted that sometimes she sensed she was inhabiting someone else's existence, performing a character she'd mastered thoroughly but never consciously selected. Marcus absorbed the gravity of her confession because he perceived how carefully she protected such thoughts, and without overstepping, he suggested it was never too late to reclaim fragments of oneself. She regarded him with an expression blending appreciation and melancholy, hoping that was accurate. The vehicle decelerated as they approached her vicinity. Marcus detected the shift in atmosphere, the way instances like this invariably carried conclusions that arrived prematurely, and he briefly wished for congestion, for a mistaken turn, for anything that might extend the evening slightly longer. As they traveled past streets familiar to her, Claire observed how unusual it was to feel genuinely acknowledged, particularly in exchanges that weren't intended to be profound. Marcus noted that sometimes the finest discussions erred unexpectedly. They shared a quiet chuckle, conscious of how improbable the circumstance was. As the precipitation softened and the road stretched ahead, Marcus recognized the journey had altered something within him, not dramatically, but in a subtle, enduring fashion. Though neither labeled it, the connection existed, delicate but authentic, propelled forward by the vehicle's motion toward a destination that now seemed nearer than either desired. The rain intensified as Marcus continued navigating, the wipers maintaining a steady tempo while the evening surrounding them dissolved into streaks of luminance and shadow. Inside the vehicle, the quiet thickened, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unexpressed thoughts. Claire eventually spoke, her voice hushed, nearly exposed, confessing that even when others believed she possessed everything, she frequently felt overlooked. Marcus, surprised by the candor, nodded, acknowledging he comprehended that sensation more than most. He admitted he'd devoted much of his life attempting to remain unnoticed, merely to survive. She turned toward him, meeting his gaze, and declared he didn't appear invisible whatsoever. That modest confession struck him more forcefully than anticipated, the words suspended between them, fragile and personal, filling the cabin in a manner that rendered the engine and the rainfall secondary. They commenced conversing in a fashion that felt spontaneous, exchanging fragments of themselves not meant for the workplace or anyone else, discussing postponed ambitions, minor regrets, instances that persisted in memory longer than warranted. Marcus discovered himself laughing at certain of Claire's anecdotes, while listening carefully to the sorrow in others, observing the nuanced equilibrium in her voice that made her appear resilient yet quietly vulnerable simultaneously. She questioned him about his younger self, the individual he'd aspired to become before reality taught him compromise. He described the chances he'd wanted to seize, the explorations he'd once envisioned, and how gradually life had shaped him into a version that was cautious, dependable, protected. She nodded in recognition, acknowledging she identified with that experience, how existence demanded constancy while quietly requiring sacrifice. The vehicle advanced, following avenues illuminated by neon reflections and occasional headlights, piercing through the downpour, the city surrounding them vibrant yet remote. While inside the car, time appeared to curve, hours resembling minutes, minutes resembling seconds. Claire suddenly remarked that certain evenings she sensed she could nearly step beyond her patterns, escape momentarily. Marcus acknowledged experiencing those instances too, when the world seemed more compact and personal. They exchanged a silence saturated with potential, a quiet comprehension that neither was transgressing boundaries, yet both recognized the fragile proximity. As the vehicle slowed near, a recognizable junction, Claire returned to music, referencing melodies connected to recollection. Marcus reciprocated with his own, and they found themselves laughing softly at mutual preferences, savoring the rare link between people who understood without assessment. The precipitation eased into a gentle mist, touching the roof delicately, a backdrop that rendered everything cinematic yet grounded, personal without being improper. Claire's fingers brushed the hem of her coat as she shifted position. Marcus caught himself observing details he hadn't previously noticed, the manner her eyes softened in particular illumination, the slight wave of hair falling forward, subtle expressions that revealed her humanity beyond the impression he'd known from the office. She unexpectedly posed a question about what he sought from existence now. Marcus paused, weighing honesty, and ultimately confessed he wanted to feel vibrant in ways employment hadn't permitted, to embrace modest risks, to encounter meaningful connection. She smiled softly, stating she comprehended precisely what he meant. The vehicle crawled now, streets narrowing, rain leaving designs on the windows, and neither wished to disrupt the rhythm, the intimacy of shared words and reflections. Yet the journey was concluding, the street lamps growing warmer as they neared her neighborhood. Marcus acknowledged how exceptional these moments were, how unplanned yet flawless this conversation had become. Claire finally interrupted the stillness, murmuring that tonight felt distinct, significant in ways she hesitated to articulate. Marcus agreed, experiencing the identical sensation, understanding they'd crossed a boundary only emotionally, not physically, but it was a threshold that mattered equally. As they reached her street, Marcus slowed the vehicle, neither prepared to speak first, the hesitation substantial yet tender, and when she opened the door she lingered briefly regarding him with an expression laden with unvoiced thoughts, and whispered that tonight had signified more than he realized. As the door latched and she vanished inside, Marcus remained seated momentarily, listening to the diminishing sounds of rainfall and distant traffic, comprehending that what had commenced as a straightforward favor had evolved into something neither would forget, an evening carrying emotions too delicate to articulate yet too powerful to dismiss, a connection born in quiet sincerity that left him simultaneously awakened and unsettled, sensing the magnitude of what had been shared and the potential of what it might represent in the approaching days. The following morning, Marcus reached the office earlier than customary. The city still hushed with only the murmur of traffic outside, and he bore a burden on his shoulders that rendered the familiar workplace different, heavier, as though the preceding night's journey had shifted something within him he couldn't yet identify. When Thomas welcomed him cordially, unaware of the complexity he'd inadvertently created, Marcus manufactured a smile and responded courteously, perceiving the contrast between casual pleasantries and the tempest of contemplations in his mind. As he proceeded toward his workstation, he recalled Claire's words, her gentle voice, the sincerity in her gaze. He speculated whether she was reflecting on the ride as well, about the quiet admissions, the shared amusement, the rain-soaked avenues that had intensified everything, made it more vivid, and although the office teemed with colleagues circulating, typing, conducting calls, Marcus felt detached, each action mechanical, rehearsed, while his consciousness replayed fragments of the evening, her expressions, the subtle warmth in her tone, how their dialogue had navigated around boundaries yet remained intimate. He observed how small instances lingered, how laughter or pauses carried greater significance than warranted, prompting him to recognize that ordinary existence now seemed less ordinary, charged with possibility. He found himself checking his messages, partially hoping for a note, a communication, anything that might bridge the divide between the workplace and the vehicle. When the message arrived from Claire, Marcus's pulse quickened, a combination of anticipation and wariness, because the subject line merely stated, appreciation. But the contents were meticulously composed, gracious and courteous, yet layered with sentiment, understated enough to remain appropriate, but transparent enough to convey the journey had meant something to her as well. He reread it, absorbing the phrasing, the considerate manner she recognized him, and he understood that what had transpired in the car transcended a simple commute. It was an instant suspended in time, shared between two individuals who had discovered understanding without expectation. As he settled back in his chair, he contemplated the obligations and limitations that now defined their relationship, recognizing he must navigate emotions that were simultaneously genuine and intricate, that he could not proceed rashly, but could not disregard either. While the office proceeded around him, he sensed a quiet separation, a feeling that part of him remained in the vehicle, in the rainfall, in the conversation that had resembled an awakening, and he wondered if Claire remembered every particular as distinctly as he did, if she too experienced the identical attraction of something unexpressed, something gentle that neither could fully claim yet both acknowledged. As he observed the clock, the hours extending, he imagined her conducting her morning, contemplating routine responsibilities, while he carried the remarkable weight of connection, the fleeting intensity of that evening. He recognized that occasionally, life's smallest gestures, a simple accommodation, a ride home, could leave the most profound impressions, transforming perception, reshaping emotions, generating a tension tha. Tea was simultaneously exhilarating and painful. He understood he must proceed thoughtfully, to honor boundaries, to respect the confidence placed in him, while simultaneously acknowledging how he had been witnessed, in a manner he rarely experienced, a sensation that was both personal and transient, delicate yet indelible. As the day progressed, correspondence, conferences, and calls flowing around him, Marcus's thoughts drifted back to the streets, slick with precipitation, the gentle rhythm of the windshield wipers, how the city had felt simultaneously alive and serene. He recognized the journey had transformed something within him, a subtle shift in outlook, a fresh awareness of yearning and connection, of emotions that could be authentic without transgressing limits. When he ultimately returned to his responsibilities, he experienced a renewed sense of attentiveness, of comprehension, of feeling carefully preserved and treasured, understanding that the evening's conversation, the drive, the shared confessions, had crystallized into a memory that would persist, that would inform his choices, that would remind him that existence, even in mundane moments, could contain extraordinary meaning, and that human connection, fragile and precious, was a gift demanding both bravery and consideration, leaving him quietly conscious that the ride home was not the conclusion, but the commencement of something that neither distance nor time could readily dissolve, a connection that would influence his thoughts, his emotions, and perhaps even his heart in ways he was only beginning to comprehend.